Yes, okay. I can check and make sure I can find
Where did we get by Zoom today? Well, yeah, she texted, she told me everything going. I said, yeah, sure, fine, say yourself.
Right.
What's up? I'm here.
Jeremy, this is Dan. Do you want me to run the meeting, or are you going to get it started for us?
No, it'd be great if you could do it. It'd be a little challenging zooming in, as long as you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Are you ready to get going?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, with that, we will call the regular meeting, August 17th regular meeting of the Trinity County Board of Supervisors to order. Would you all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Presentations. Oh, I guess we have public comment. Sorry, it's been a while since I ran one of these. Public comment. This time is for information from the public on matters not appearing on this agenda or within the consent calendar. All comments are limited to 3 minutes and must pertain to matters within the jurisdiction of the board. When addressing the board, please state your name for the record and address. Address the board as a whole through the chair. No action or discussion will be conducted on matters not listed on the agenda. However, the chair may refer the subject matter to the appropriate department for follow-up or schedule the matter on a subsequent board agenda. Do we have any public comment?
Is there any public comment from within the room? Okay, seeing none. I have no raised hands and no new chats.
Okay, we will close public comment period and move on to presentations. Clerk of the board, item 1.1, receive a presentation from Trinity River Restoration Program Executive Director Mike Dixon regarding their projects on the Trinity River. No fiscal impact.
All right, can you guys all hear me all right with my mask on? I apologize, my daughter's not old enough to be vaccinated yet, so big groups inside, I tend to take it careful.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, and on Zoom? Excellent. Emma, do you have the PowerPoint queued up? All right, well, first off, you guys are going to get kind of off the cuff Mike Dixon, because I have presenter notes associated with these slides that I can't see in this format, so you're going to see how good I think I'm going to be. So, yeah, I appreciate the time to present to the board and give an update on what the program's activities have been recently, and that we were able to work through some of the scheduling hiccups over the last month or so trying to get a presentation on the agenda. So I titled this presentation what you see here based on a couple things. One is last December, during the height of COVID, the program kind of quietly, unheralded, celebrated its 20th birthday. And I just wanted to highlight that over those 20 years, we've continued to look forward or downstream rather than resting on the science that was the foundation of the program. Next slide, please. And so that looking forward is kind of the overall theme of this presentation. So I'm going to start by giving an introduction to what the restoration program does and who we are, and then move through the various ways that our restoration tools have been improved through time through the adaptive management process. And then I'll end with some other introspective, but again, forward-leaning things that we're undertaking right now to continue to adjust and improve the way that the program is implemented. Next slide. So I wanted to start with just a quick check-in on terminology, because a lot of us who eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff take for granted words that we throw around carelessly. One of the words that we use a lot is anadromous fish. It's kind of central to the program. So all anadromous fish means is a fish that spends a portion of its life cycle in freshwater and a portion of its life cycle in saltwater. We have a suite of different species of anadromous fish here. In this slide, I'm highlighting some of the most important fisheries that are anadromous in the river. There are others, like green sturgeon, but they tend to occur only in the lowest reaches of the river, and so the restoration program doesn't directly work on projects related to those species. Next slide. I've also included a You Are Here slide, not because I don't think that the board members know where Weaverville is, but just to kind of set the context for what we do in the broader region. So we work primarily in the upper 40 miles of the Trinity River, and the entire Trinity River watershed is depicted here in that in red. The Trinity is the largest tributary of the Klamath River, which is a pretty big deal from the perspective of an anadromous fish. So what this means is all of our fish that spend the beginning months of their life or years of their life in freshwater have to leave the Trinity and go through the Klamath on their way to the ocean. And this is problematic for an anadromous fish. For a long time now, but particularly this past year, the lower Klamath is a really, really hostile place for juvenile fish. The monitoring that occurred on the Klamath River just upstream of the Trinity River confluence this year, I mean, it's preliminary, but it would be appropriate, I think, to infer that more or less the entire year's production of Chinook salmon died before they left the Klamath River because of a disease called Ceratinoga shasta. And even though that monitoring was not continued downstream of the confluence of the Trinity at Wichita, I think it would be appropriate to infer that we lost a lot of our fish this year before they ever had a chance to reach the ocean. But then those fish do reach the ocean, and we've been fortunate in this last year. We've had some pretty good ocean rearing conditions in the Pacific, off of California in particular, but that was not the case in the mid-2010s. And we had a lot of our fish reach the ocean and find that they had nothing to eat, and so our returns were really, really impaired in the mid-2010s through now by a lack of ocean productivity for a variety of reasons, partially related to climate change. Next slide. But getting to the program itself, so the Trinity River Restoration Program is a formal partnership of 8 federal, tribal, state agencies, as well as Trinity County. They share a common purpose that's articulated here in this goal statement at the bottom of the slide. This was passed unanimously by the Trinity Management Council, which is our governance board, back in 2019. And I'll paraphrase, more or less what this says is we're a process-based restoration program. We're restoring the anadromous fish of the Trinity River, and we're specifically restoring those anadromous fish to facilitate harvest. And that does set the restoration program apart from almost every other federal restoration program that I can think of. We have endangered fish in the Trinity River, but we are not an endangered species recovery program. We attempt to restore ecosystem processes in the Trinity River, but we are not an ecosystem recovery program. We're explicitly a program that exists to restore fish for people. And I just want to highlight that before we go through the presentation. Next slide. I think it's easy to draw attention to some of the places where we've fallen short of what was initially envisioned in the program, so I want to make sure we lead in with some of the things that we have managed to accomplish in the last 20 years. One of the things that people take for granted is the significant reduction, massive reduction in the amount of fine sediment in the upper Trinity River. At the inception of the program, there was a ton of sand and silt coming into the upper river, largely as a product of poorly regulated road construction that was associated with forestry practices. And we've made great strides both in working with watershed partners to reduce those fine sediment problems and with scouring that sediment out of the upper river, and we now feel that there is actually not a major fine sediment problem in the upper Trinity River. And there's big caveats there. That's not the case in burn scars. Like in the Carr Creek scar, we do get the contribution of a lot of fine sediment right now. And certainly the South Fork Trinity River is going to for a long time to come, be dealing with multi-generational fine sediment problems. But we do feel like we've largely addressed this issue in the upper Trinity. Another thing that is sort of out of sight, out of mind, but was really foundational to the science at the beginning of the program was the encroachment of trees onto the active river channel and how that kind of caused the channel to be locked in place. And we have shown recently with a report that was completed this year that we've more or less mitigated this problem of riparian encroachment. Our flows are doing a really, really good job at keeping the trees away from the active edge of the flooded channel. But more related to the stuff that people see and relating to our goals of actually bringing fish back, Our monitoring showed a significant and sustained increase in the amount of Chinook salmon, juvenile Chinook salmon habitat in particular, at our restoration sites. And perhaps even more significantly, we've had a substantial, and in fact doubling, of the number of Chinook smolts that are produced in the upper river. Smolts are the fish that are leaving the river for the ocean. And I think this is the best metric of our success, because while we have lofty kind of aspirational goals related to adult returns, the thing that we really control, the thing that we have an influence over, is how productive the upper river is for juveniles, because they live such a small portion of their life in the Trinity River itself. And one thing that I think is an intriguing finding, and I have an asterisk on it here because it's a preliminary thing and it's about to go through peer review, are a couple of things. An interesting apparent reduction in the amount of interannual variability in Chinook returns. So while we haven't seen an increasing trend, the amount of wild swinging year to year seems to have moderated since the restoration program actions were initiated. And also an apparent increase in the number of natural origin adult steelhead returning to the Trinity River. Next slide. So for the bulk of the talk, I'm going to talk about the tools that we have to work with to restore the Trinity River. The record of decision that was signed in 2000 by Secretary Bruce Babbitt included 5 tools that we were to use to restore the Trinity, and all of those tools were to be looked at through the process of adaptive management. And what that means is as we design and implement our tools, we concurrently then monitor the effectiveness of those interventions and determine how successful we are, and then alter course accordingly based on what we've learned. And I say we have 5 tools. There's only 4 pictured on this slide because we also were directed to undertake an infrastructure improvement program to clear the floodway of infrastructure that would impede flows. And so this was largely completed in 2012. We basically replaced a lot of bridges, we elevated some roads, we bought out and relocated a house, and we improved countless septic and domestic water systems. There is a single house that remains in the floodway in the Junction City area, and we're working with that willing landowner and our realty office to try and find some common ground solution to mitigate that problem. But I'm going to spend the rest of the talk on the sort of on-the-ground tools that we're doing now. Next slide. So I think inarguably our most powerful tool is our restoration flows, and this is because flows influence everything from how much food is available for fish, when the fish choose to leave the river, what species of trees grow along the river and where they grow, where we have riffles versus pools, how deep those pools are. Flows tie everything else in the river together. They're also, they really are the thing that unifies all of our other restoration tools. Our flows are determined based on a water year determination from the State Department of Water Resources, so we get a fixed volume depending upon how much inflow is projected into Trinity Lake. But the actual schedule of when those flows are released is determined by our program scientists, and it's called a hydrograph. Next slide. So this is an example of a hydrograph, and it's to illustrate kind of how we've shifted our approach to flow management through time based on what we've learned. So the dashed line there is the nominal or recommended wet year hydrograph. This was 2019 was a wet year that was recommended early on when the program was established. And the black line is what we actually released that year, and it shows a couple things that we've adjusted through time. One is that we've learned that we get way more bang for the buck. We move way more water, or way more rock with the same amount of water if we do multiple peaks of shorter duration than doing one single long peak, and you can see that here. Another thing that we've learned that I'm going to get into in the next 2 slides is how important it is for us to shift the timing of our peak releases earlier. And so in this case, we basically moved the peak releases as early as we can using our current policy constraints. Next slide. So when I say current policy constraints, one of the things that is a real issue for us is that naturally the Trinity River is its highest and most variable in the winter and early spring period, which is the time of year when the Trinity is flat based on our dam releases, at least until you get major tributary contribution downstream. And so what you're seeing on this particular hydrograph are, in white is the amount, that was the water we actually released to the Trinity River that year, and in green is the full natural flow of the Trinity River in the absence of Trinity and Lewiston dams based on inflow calculations. And so this was a critically dry year. This is the same kind of water year category that we're in right now. This was 2018. And you can see just how variable and just how high the Trinity would have naturally gotten in the absence of those dams. And this is a big issue because salmon evolved with a higher and much more variable river in the winter period. So ecologically, it makes sense to make the river more natural. But specific findings that we've found that really underscore this are, by the time we start releasing our water, starting in mid-April, based on the water year determination, in an average year, 60 or more % of the Chinook from the upper Trinity River have already left the upper 40 miles of the river. So the tens of millions of dollars that we've spent on habitat construction and improvement in the upper river are not being effectively utilized because a lot of that habitat isn't even available to fish before they leave. Another thing that we've discovered that's a big challenge for us is that our flows increase at precisely the time of the year that the Trinity would naturally be decreasing in flow and increasing in temperature. And what this means to a cold-blooded animal like a fish is it crashes their metabolism. We dump a bunch of cold water off the bottom of Trinity Lake right when the river's starting to warm up, and we slow their growth substantially. The other thing this does is it sends really weird signals to these fish that evolves to think, all right, the river's been warm for a while now, it's time for me to start booking for the ocean. We then cool the river substantially, and we really mix up those out-migration signals. And what this has resulted in is we found that while we're creating a lot more smolts, those smolts on average are smaller than they were prior to the initiation of our restoration flows, and they tend to get out of the Trinity River at a time of year when the lower Trinity and certainly the Klamath are much more hostile to them than the time they naturally would have out-migrated. So this has led to an effort that started in about 2017 to reshape how we use our flows, and this is called our winter flow variability proposal. Next slide. So there's a lot of objectives that are tied into this winter flow variability proposal, but it really boils down to two things. It is to bring the river down to summer base flow earlier in the season to address some of these temperature impacts that I'm talking about, and to take that saved water and use it during the winter and early spring period when those fish naturally would have used those habitats. And so that's what's pictured here on this winter flow variability graph. This is the actual hydrograph in blue that we released in 2016, which was again a wet year. And then if we were to apply this winter flow variability rule set that we're currently analyzing to that water volume, in green is what we might have actually released that year. You can see what I'm talking about, where the river comes down to summer base flow in mid-June instead of July, and we've added a lot of variability to the river earlier in the season. So we're getting fish out onto those floodplains at the time of year when they actually need those floodplains. Can you click ahead? Oh, it's cut off. The one thing that I wanted to highlight with this is that the record of decision was extremely clear that while we can apply science and appropriate analysis to change the timing of when our volume of restoration water is released, we can't actually change the volume itself. And so what's shown in blue and what's shown in green is the exact same volume of water. So we're not proposing to bring more water through this proposal, we're just proposing to use the water that we have more efficiently. And so we have an environmental assessment that analyzes this proposal that should be released for public comment in early September. Next slide. So our most visible and certainly our noisiest restoration tool is our channel rehabilitation work. So this is basically the use of big yellow machines to either directly construct fish habitat or to remove the impediments to the river constructing and maintaining its own habitat. Next slide. At the time of the ROD, there were 47 sites that were identified upstream of the North Fork Trinity River for channel rehabilitation work. Through time, we've determined that there's a couple of those sites that actually, from an ecological standpoint, work pretty well, and we're probably not going to do restoration work there. There's also a handful of sites where just practicalities like ownership and access make it so that it's unlikely that we would ever actually do restoration work at those locations. So if you count up those sites with the sites that have already been constructed, we have roughly 7 restoration sites left. But it's important to recognize that most of those 7 sites are in the Junction City Valley, which was far and away the most heavily mining impacted section of the restoration reach, and it also has the most valley width and habitat potential. So each of these sites individually is the equivalent of several early sites in terms of its actual construction effort that it requires. Next slide. And this includes the area where we were building a project this summer called Chapman Ranch. This is just upstream of Junction City, a couple miles up from the Dutch Creek Bridge. This was a very heavily mined impacted reach of river, giant tailings piles on both sides, and big terraces of flattened mined sediment where there weren't tailings. And what that did is it basically caused the river to be constrained into this canal-like channel. Next slide. And that canal-like channel is what's depicted here in this graph at the top right, and it may be a little hard to make out the scale, so I'll just explain it. Basically what you see is on the x-axis going across is flow, and on the y-axis going up is the acres of Chinook salmon juvenile habitat. And so what you can see is as flow increases from left to right, there's actually a reduction in the amount of habitat that's available. And the reason for this is, like I say, it's a straight canal-like channel. As flows come up, the water had nowhere to go, and so all it can do is go down and faster, and that makes it increasingly unsuitable for fish. So next slide, 2 clicks, I guess. So the intent of this Chapman Ranch project was to increase the amount of habitat that's available in a range of flows, and that's what's depicted here in the model restored condition. And, there's 3 times the acreage of suitable habitat at the lowest flows that reach sees, and that habitat sustains itself at frequently recurring winter flows up to about 2,500 cubic feet per second, instead of decreasing the flow. And then as flow increases above that in winter flow events or spring restoration releases, that habitat actually continues to increase as floodplains engage. So this is the philosophy with which we approach our modern channel rehabilitation projects. And I should put a big asterisk on Chapman Ranch. We were intending to complete that project in early September with the monument fire evacuation. It's currently on hold. So while we've gotten all the potential hazards out of the river channel, but we've also had to demobilize all of the equipment and personnel. So this may be a project that we actually have to go in and complete later, depending upon what happens with that fire this year. Next slide. Another one of our tools is gravel augmentation. So gravel augmentation is probably the most commonly implemented restoration action on dammed rivers in the world. And it's for a pretty straightforward reason. Rivers need gravel to move through them in order, or other sediment to move through them in order to build their channel. Dams trap all of that sediment, so you have to go in below the dam and add that sediment back in. We've been doing this on the Trinity River since the 1970s, but even though it's a fairly intuitive tool, and even though we've been doing it for a long time, we continue to refine how we do this. One of the earliest things that we refined with our gravel augmentation strategy is just the sheer volume of gravel. So when the science behind the record of decision was finalized, they envisioned that we were going to need vastly more gravel. So, for example, in an extremely wet year, they envisioned that we were going to put between 40-some and 60-some thousand cubic yards of gravel in an extremely wet year. On average, even in the wettest years, we typically wouldn't put more than 6,000 cubic yards of gravel in. On average, we put 3,000 or 4,000. We've learned through how rock moves through the river that we don't need as much gravel as they initially envisioned, and so we scaled that back a lot accordingly. Next slide. You don't necessarily need to dwell on the details of this slide. It's an excerpt from a study that was published a few years ago. But what it illustrates is another way that we've applied what we've learned about how rock moves down the river. This is a place below a gravel augmentation site where we iteratively added gravel and then monitored an increase in the amount of suitable fish habitat. And then we saw that habitat plateau, and so we paused. We said, well, all right, we're going to let the river work through this gravel. We're not just going to keep putting more gravel in if it's not creating more habitat. So we continue to adapt how we use this tool through time. Next slide. The final tool that I'll touch on is our watershed restoration efforts. I led in with a mention that we feel like we've largely mitigated the fine sediment problems in the upper Trinity River. Again, there's places, this is in the Deadwood Creek watershed and the Carr Fire burn scar, where that's not the case. But by and large, we feel that we've mitigated the fine sediment issues in most of these tributaries. And so we've shifted our focus on what we believe are the other major limiting factors in our tributaries. Next slide. And so these are things like habitat quality. So on the left picture here, this is a project that we funded that was implemented by the Trinity County Resource Conservation District that substantially increased the suitability of the fish habitat and the riparian forest in this section of West Beaver Creek, just outside of town here. In the bottom right is a major barrier to fish passage, and we funded a partner who's going to replace the water intake at that location with a fish-friendly structure and remove this dam that blocks all steelhead from migrating up this creek. And in the top right, this is an open flow ditch. This is a legal diversion. But we have a lot of legal diversions in the Trinity River Basin. And we've definitely learned that certainly in a changing climate, and certainly for coho and steelhead in particular, that late summer and early fall flows are a major limiting factor for these species in our watershed. So we're working with willing landowners on things to improve the efficiency with which they use their irrigation, and to provide opportunities for storage so that they don't need to divert as much water in those low flow periods. Again, so continually trying to address what the key limiting factors are based on modern science. The one other thing that I'll address with our watershed program is an open acknowledgement that we've had hiccups with getting grants actually out the door and implemented for the last few years. And so right now we're in the finishing stage of awarding a grant to a third-party national nonprofit who's going to administer a 5-year grant program on our behalf. And we'll continue to be, the Trinity Management Council will continue to be involved with the prioritization of what sorts of projects are funded, but this should really streamline things for the grantees and help make sure that a lot more of this money ends up on the ground in a timely manner. Next slide. So I want to touch on the TRRP refinements effort. So this was a process that started back in 2014 with a request from the Hoopa Valley and Yurok tribes that was carried by the Trinity Management Council, our governance board, to Reclamation, and we set aside funding, and Reclamation hired a contractor to basically do a governance review of the program. So I want to illustrate or underscore here really that this was not like a scathing external audit. We asked for this because we recognized that there was room for improvement, and we thought that the findings of that report were important enough that we then set aside the funding and again asked the Bureau of Reclamation to contract for a contractor to lead us through the implementation of those findings. Next slide. And so this is taking the form of some work that's going on right now and should be completed by mid-next year. One of these is the development of a program document, and Supervisor Groves is on the committee that's developing this document. This is to basically work us through the various mechanisms that we need to adjust our governance to be more efficient. And this includes the recognition that there are important groups of stakeholders like water and power customers, the hospitality industry, commercial fishermen, steelhead guides, etc., who are not adequately represented in the governance board of the program. And this was exacerbated under the previous administration when the previous Secretary of the Interior abolished our stakeholder advisory. So we're working through the process right now of figuring out what does that new stakeholder group look like, and that'll be a component of this program document. And then the other component of this is the science and monitoring plan. And this was in recognition that we tend to do adaptive management in a fairly informal manner, and if we can really sync up our objectives and our long-term monitoring, we can be a lot more structured with how we implement adaptive management. And Supervisor Gogan is actually on this committee. Next slide. And this is my last slide. Sorry, I'm going a little long probably. There's just a few other things that we have going on. Since 2012, it's been recognized that there are limitations with the infrastructure at Trinity and Lewiston dams, which make it so that we don't use water as efficiently as we could. Right now, to control temperature, we have to use flow. We can only turn the flow knob. And that's not necessarily the most efficient way to use water. So the Trinity Management Council did ask Reclamation to pursue those, whatever engineering investigations would be required in order to implement solutions to use our water more efficiently and make more water available for everybody, really. Another thing that we have going on is we're going to have a series of brown bag seminars coming up this fall where various program scientists are going to be presenting recent findings from reports that have been published in the last couple of years. Those will culminate in November in a science symposium where all of those scientists will convene and talk about what we've learned, but specifically in the context of what it means for what we should be doing next. And all of those seminars and the symposium itself will be open to the public and we'll be advertising them. And then the last item to draw attention to is this Phase 2 channel rehabilitation review. I think a couple members of the board are aware of the Phase 1 review that was completed. This was an analysis of the effectiveness of all of our projects that were constructed through 2010. We have not had an external review of our channel rehabilitation efforts since that time, so I asked the Trinity Management Council to set aside funds for us to hire an external contractor to develop a suite of actionable recommendations that we should consider as we move forward through these last big channel rehabilitation sites. And next slide. And I just wanted to leave with, these are photos from the Junction City Weir this summer where we monitored our spring Chinook returns. I thought they were good pictures to just, again, illustrate the purpose of this program is to bring back fish forward. So that is what I had for you guys. What questions does the board have, Chapman?
Thank you. Any questions from the board?
But if I can add some stuff so people understand where Trinity's role is in this, or Trinity Board of Supervisors. First off, Mike, thank you for the presentation. I will take a little umbrage with you. The upper Trinity below the dam, not the upper Trinity.
Fair enough.
So to some of us, that's important. So just to highlight where Trinity's stance is, I think it's important. We've had people come in here and tell us the role of Trinity County is to be an oversight committee of TMC. My view, and the view of past boards, that the new board can decide what they want, is that's absolutely false. We are an equal partner with the other agencies are in it, and we are there to work with those other agencies the best we can for the best for Trinity County. So with that, Trinity County Stamps was very disappointed in losing the TANWAG and been fully supportive in this refinements process to bring on new stakeholders group. However, we do want it to be a little more efficient than the past one. The other questions is there's been a lot of people talk about increasing the TMC to have stakeholders on it, and in the refinements process so far, there has been no interest from any other group besides Trinity County's view on that, and not to make it a FACA group. And I think at this point there's really no chance of any real change on who sits on that committee as agencies. Our stand on the water usage or the water flows and moving to more winter cycle, we've been extremely excited about that proposal. Feel that that will be a game changer in this whole process. And but the one caveat, and I think it's very important, and hopefully we don't get bogged down in it, that no more water than what the rod is to go into this process. If we get in a fight trying to get more water, the fish will lose, because that will take years and years and years to change this process. Those are kind of the highlights of what Mike went over here. Always free to answer, always available to answer questions on how we voted and where our stand is.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a few questions. Mike, thank you very much. I probably have more questions than the rest of the board, as you probably knew. So some of the questions that I do have, and not all in order, but if we can go back to your slides, I just wanted to kind of go through them as you went through them. All right, here we go. Yeah. So these are your bullet points on the progress since 2000, 20 years, $250 million. Major reduction in fine sediment problems. Commend you on that. Although a couple of meetings back at TMC, there was talk about reaching the Hamilton ponds to introduce fine sediment into the upper river. So a little bit confused about reduction and then adding. But, do you have an answer about that?
I think there's conversation going on at the technical level of the program about what an appropriate volume of fine sediment in the upper river is. There is a feeling to some extent that certain portions of the Supervisor Groves concerned of the Trinity River below Lewiston, not the Trinity River, where there does appear to actually be a deficit of fine sediments. Fines are important for river processes. We need them to build the benches that trees grow on and floodplain vegetation. So if you don't have enough, that's also a problem. So that's where that conversation was going. And there's no proposal to do anything specific.
All right, we'll stay with that slide. So significant and sustained increases in juvenile salmon habitat and salmon rehabilitation sites. If that's the case, why no return of adult salmon in the last 20 years? In fact, anything but a good return. I think we're down to probably, in the last 20 years, 15% of historic numbers. So for making juveniles, why are we not making adults?
Okay, I touched on a little bit of that, but I probably should tie the dots together a little better. So we do know that the actual habitat construction is paying dividends in terms of the smolts that are produced, because per adult spawner that lays eggs the previous season, we're sending twice as many smolts downriver, and there's no way that that could happen if we hadn't increased the capacity of the upper river below Lewiston to support those juvenile fish. Some of the things that are limiting us right now are a couple things that we control, and that's the timing and temperature of our flows, which is one of the impetus for this initial step to revise the way that we schedule our rod water. And other things that are a big issue, it is a fact that I think we can't get adult fish to come back from the ocean if they all die before they get to the ocean. So we really have to wait for some other things that are ongoing in Klamath to be sorted out in order for us to really reach our long-term goals. There's a pretty strong body of evidence that would suggest that so Strattonova shasta, this disease that I alluded to, is a naturally occurring organism in the Klamath River. It is occurring at scales that are vastly out of whack with what the river would have naturally supported. And it does seem to be that is exacerbated substantially by the sediment that's trapped behind the lower dams on the Klamath River. So the thought is, with the removal of those lower dams, we should see a fairly dramatic and substantial reduction of Strattonova shasta prevalence in the Klamath, which should make it much less hostile for our fish to get from the Trinity to the ocean.
Okay. Since that's been known for quite a while, is it significant to spend as much money and time on making juveniles just to know that the ocean conditions are 95% of the time that they live outside of your purvey will say that these smolts are not doing well for all reasons, ocean conditions included?
Obviously, we'd like to see a higher proportion of our smolts return as adults, but we can't get adults if we don't produce smolts. And that's actually part of why I said that actually at the bottom of this slide, the reduced interannual variability of Chinook returns, I think there's a lot more analysis that needs to happen to dive into what that means and what mechanistic things were going on there. But I would suggest that by producing a lot more smolts, what we've done is kept the bottom from falling out altogether of the fall Chinook population in the Klamath River Basin. So if we hadn't been taking these efforts and producing more smolts, we may not have fall Chinook in some years at all in this basin, is where I'm going with that.
Liam, may I? So, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, and one of the reasons I've been very excited about this water issue and changing the flows is that it's not a linear process and these numbers are going to be wrong, so if a smolt leaves the river and it's 2 grams in size, if you make it 4 grams in size when it leaves the river, it's not just a linear function, it actually triples or quadruples in size.
It's an exponential type curve.
So the fact that the fish are leaving late, there's not enough food because we are delaying the little bugs along the way is a great potential for improvement, correct?
So basically, the smaller the fish are, the more likely they are to be picked off by predators, and the smaller range of food items they have available to them. So there's, as you say, a really strong correlation between the size at which they leave the estuary of the river for the ocean and the number of them that return once we get to the river. So that is the one thing that we have a lot of control over right now, and that's why we're trying to address that. Thank you.
So the projects in the past have not addressed that at all?
This is the most significant change to the way that we've managed flows since 2000. So I guess there really hasn't been an attempt. We've been constrained within the bounds of the existing analysis of our flows, and we had to expand that in order to do this.
So the analysis of your flows, how were they peer reviewed?
We've had several reports published in the last 2 years that all went through external peer review. We have a white paper, which was basically it's a description of a potential course of action. It's currently being reviewed by our science advisory board. But the foundation of the science of this proposal has all been through some level of peer review already.
Somewhat of a peer review means what?
Well, I don't know that we really want to get into the details of how individual types of reports are reviewed, but generally, we receive a report from all of the agency scientists, whoever the authors are. The science coordinator within the program works with our science advisory board to identify potential peer reviewers, whether that's people who are peer reviewing pro bono or people who are peer reviewing through a contract that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administers. Those people provide their comments back. Those comments are reviewed in an editorial manner, and the authors of that paper have to address those comments in order for the report to be finalized.
And when will we know about that?
I can refer you to several of the reports that are completed right now, and let's see, the one report that is cited in this proposal, I think the only report that's cited in this proposal that is currently not, that is in review, is the temperature synthesis report, and that should be completed by the end of September.
And who's the author of that?
It was a contractor named Eli Asarian with a company out of Arcata, as well as some collaborators, I think the Yurok tribe, and I'd have to look at the author list. I actually can't answer that off the top of my head.
All right, we can go on to the next slide.
Try to pick your most important questions. They're all Supervisor Goggins. We are going to have to recess here shortly.
So this is going to watershed restoration.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I think this is an important enough issue that when we recess, and I know Mike's time is very valuable, that can we come back to this after the recess?
I was going to, actually going to ask Dr. Coons about that, and Mike also, if we could return to this item after our recess for fire briefing.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, 10 o'clock is a hard 10 o'clock, but
Yeah.
if Mike is available, we could absolutely come back.
I'm going to stay for the fire briefing anyways. I'm clear through noon. So.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
All right, so I guess we'll go ahead with your questions for about another minute or so, and then we'll have to start working on recess, and we'll come back to this when we're done with briefing.
So watershed restoration, I was kind of quickly going through these now. Watershed restoration is, so watershed restoration is a big part of restoration. It's supposed to be spending somewhere $2,000, about $1.8 million a year. And I don't think it's ever been funded much more than $500,000 a year. And most of the years, quite a bit less than that. I think every year almost less than that. 1 year perhaps over that. Some years none of that. So if it's such a big part of your restoration program, why the lack of funding annually?
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I can address that in a minute. All right, go. So for one, the record decision didn't address the annual amount of money to be spent on watershed restoration. There was some discussion in the EIS when they were looking at different alternatives and what speculative amount of restoration funding for watershed work would be. And that was discussed in the implementation plan for the program that was an appendix to the EIS in the context of where the possible sources for that funding could be. So for one, it was never envisioned that reclamation's restoration dollars paid for by water and power customers was going to be the sole source of funding for watershed restoration in the Trinity Basin. Watershed restoration in the Trinity Basin is and always have been the most, it's the most partner-driven facet of what we do. And a lot of our partners are implementing work, Resource Conservation District among them, using our money as match for other money. So it would be inaccurate to say that we only spend $500,000 a year when that $500,000 has included grants to third parties who have leveraged those grants to get 2 to 3, sometimes 4 times as much money from other grants, as well as the other watershed-related activities that we funded that don't fall under that $500,000, like the management of the Hamilton ponds and things of that nature. So I think that it's a little bit misleading to say that we've only spent $500,000 a year on average on watershed activities, because it's a much bigger scope than that. But I don't disagree that, particularly as it relates to our goals for steelhead and coho salmon, our tributaries are absolutely essential. We will not restore our target numbers of steelhead and coho salmon without aggressively working in the tributaries. You do have to recognize a little bit, though, that because this is a fisheries restoration program and a big component of that fishery is commercial and subsistence harvest, the vast majority of that commercial and subsistence harvest are Chinook salmon, and almost none of our tributary streams are noteworthy for Chinook salmon areas.
So how are we doing on that end?
I'm going to add just a hair here quick. So just so people know where Trinity County has made stand on this is when I first got on this, the annual number that was funded was $250,000. And working with some people, Tom Stokely for one, I worked hard to get that number up to $500,000, which has been funded pretty consistently at that number. Now what's been spent is of course a different issue.
All right, I think we're going to have to hold off on questions now until after we get through briefing, and then we'll come back to this.
Thank you, Mike.
Hopefully shortly after 10. We will go into a recess now until after fire briefing.
We are estimating reopening open session at approximately 11:15.
My briefing only takes like 10 minutes. There's only like 4 of us.
Yeah, that's gonna be the new team stuff. They had stuff to do, so they'll just introduce themselves and come back out. They can introduce themselves to everybody and we'll come out of recess.
Absolutely. So this probably means that the attending every day,
Yeah.
not a part of the presentation to the fire.
Yeah, so most of the time it's the 2 board members present for this because it's not open to the public.
Right.
So I have a different fire briefing than I want to do on the phone, so I'm doing Coffee Creek's fire briefing.
How's that looking? It didn't sound that great on the radio.
It's not that great. We probably had some structure loss, but that's just speculation at this time, but it's aggressive and moving on.
After that, we can get some update and go back. Yeah, it didn't look good at all.
But it's not nearly as bad as what you guys are facing.
Good.
That's great. I'm not against each other now.
So then Jeremy should be in
Jeremy is not in the room. Oh, he's not.
He's on Zoom, bro. We'll be on Zoom. So
I was
right now,
asking because we hadn't
yeah.
heard about it yesterday.
Yeah, Margaret helped.
Yeah. So right now, the threat is more east, southeast, and south. Our goal was to make it that westerly push, easterly push, and after which go on far. So it's really, it's in all 3 of your guys' districts.
It's got the structures threatened are in Leon's district and Jeremy's district.
So they're leaving here?
Since this is.
leave too?
No, they're staying here for a different meeting, for their like 10 a.m. fire break that they.
So we're adjourned, the regular
Yes.
board meeting's adjourned?
Yes,
All right.
sorry.
So, I'm willing to step out if Liam wants to take the reins because the part of Hayford